Number one, that's a racist comment. Think about it. You're imputing an activity to an entire, well, several races of people over there. It's also a little hypocritical when we've been involved in wars in the 20th century that killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 million people. They haven't even gotten anywhere close to that yet. But before you get there, and you say that those people are just violent, think about the fact that they start encountering one another in the late 1800s, early 1900s in here. And we don't really see larger scale violence between the two groups until really the 1920s. That's when you really first start having larger scale violence. So think about that. Some of these folks have been holding their breath, fearing, hating the other side. They've been holding their breath for decades without organizing any large scale violence. In my opinion, that shows a certain amount of patience on both their sides. So how does the large-scale violence come about? Well, that's kind of interesting. It's somewhat predictable, but it's interesting. The Ottomans stirred the pot first. Then we have World War I. World War I comes along, and if you look at the map up there, that's a map of World War I. Okay? All the green stuff is the Central Powers. All the pink Pepto-Bismol colored stuff is the Allied powers. Okay? So the Ottoman Empire was on the side of the Central Powers. So that means countries like Britain and France were fighting the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Okay. They weren't doing a good job of it at first, to be honest. They were losing in many cases. In fact, Winston Churchill kind of stumbled in his career pretty badly on this whole thing. They were having a hard time getting any traction in the Ottoman Empire. So they needed help. So the British approached, first of all, different Arab tribes inside the Ottoman Empire. Now here's an important distinction to make. When I say Ottoman Empire, you folks tend to think Muslim Empire, you tend to think Arabs. Not entirely true. The Ottomans that ruled this empire were Turks. Okay? Different people group. Ask an Arab or a Turk anytime. They'll tell you they're different. They make that distinction very, very clear. The Turks ruled the Ottoman Empire, and there was some pretty bad blood between the Turks who ruled it and the Arabs who lived there, who were the dominant population. So what happens is the British go down there and they say, you guys hate the Turks, right? Yep. You want a chance to kill some? Sure. What do we got to do? And they make a deal. Here's the deal. There's a series of letters that go back and forth between leaders on the leaders on the British side and leader in the Arab tribe side. And these are oftentimes called the Hussein-McMahon letters. Most of them took place in 1915. The Hussein-McMahon letters, let's see if I can find another marker. My third one's dying on me. The Hussein-McMahon letters basically make a deal between the British and the Arab tribes. And the deal is, if you're willing to fight and die for our cause and fight the Turks and help us out, when we win against the Turks and take part of their empire back, you will have your land back. Okay? We will give you your Arab lands back that the Turks took from you. That's the deal. Well, works out pretty well for the British because the Arab tribes unite, something that's pretty hard to do, and fight against the Turks and manage to distract the Turks in many cases long enough for the British to get a toehold in the Ottoman Empire. Ultimately, the British will win against the Ottoman Empire and they will carve it up. But there's another people group they asked for help from later on in the conflict, and that was Jewish populations in Britain as well as other places, but particularly in Britain. And they asked them for financial support, help to finance the war. Wars are expensive. You always need money, right? Well, a deal gets struck between the Jewish population in Britain and the British government to help. And this plays out in the 1918, what's called Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration makes a deal and says, we will view with favor for the establishment of a Jewish state inside that territory. Now they have all sorts of other language in there that says, as long as it doesn't go against the rights of the native population. They have nice stuff in there. Doesn't really work out so well that way, but that is couched in the Balfour Declaration in all fairness to the Brits. But my point here that I'm trying to drive at is to win the war, the Brits were willing to do just about anything. And in doing so, they ended up promising the land to Arab tribes, later on to some Jewish populations. We could even get into the Sykes-Picot Agreement where they promised it to Greece and Greece and Russia and several other powers. The British make promises to lots of people to win this war. Maybe it's excusable because it's a war and people do things like that. Maybe. I don't know if I buy that. But in this particular case, you got two people groups that have already been thrust together, already have reason to distrust and fear one another and not like each other, and then you make them both promises separately that they're going to have this land. That's a setup for disaster. These people are already scared and hateful and not liking each other. You promise them the land, you win the war, and then you don't make good on it in the 20s? There's violence. Large scale, in the 20s for the first time. Anybody know when World War I ended?
1918.
Yeah, by the time you get to the treaty, 1919. Right. So, Treaty of Versailles, 1919, violence in the 1920s. Imagine that. You got two people groups down there that woke up and went, wait a minute. We bled and died, or we gave money, or whatever. We sacrificed for you, and you said this land would be ours. We've been holding our breath for decades to try to resolve this problem, and now we don't get a resolution. So they take matters into their own hands. And you start seeing large-scale strikes and riots and civil unrest in the 20s. Like I said, I don't have time to go into all the details if I'm going to cover 100 years of history, but this is really the first time you get large-scale spikes. Okay. Next. Time goes on. Now, the British own this area. It's called a British Mandate, which is the idea means that the British will control it for a while until the population there can rule itself, and then they will, liberate them in a sense, let them go on their own way. That's the idea, at least. Well, that starts going on for a while. There's violence. The British are trying to kind of keep a lid on it. It's not good. And then we come along, and there's World War II. And obviously, the British are distracted in World War II. They get really, really close to losing it right inside the first year of that war. In fact, they're the only democracy holding on for a year there by themselves. They're very distracted, so they're not focusing a lot of attention down here. Well, this is World War II, keep in mind. This is not just your average war. This is a war of unspeakable brutality, particularly, of course, for the Jewish population in Europe. We're talking the Holocaust. We're talking 6 million Jews who are slaughtered, not just killed, but tortured and killed in pretty much some of the most unspeakable ways human minds can come up with. And that's saying a lot, because human minds can come up with a lot. So you have a Holocaust, a horrific event. And the Jews that survived this literal hell on earth that has gone on in Europe now want a place to go. And here's the problem. A lot of European countries, America was no better, started restricting the amount of Jewish immigration that could come to their shores. So we've now had hell on earth happen. And they're looking for a place to go. Where do we decide they should go? Here's an idea. Let's send them down where their brethren are already in a fight. And it's not to say that many Jews didn't want to go to Palestine. Many did. Many would have preferred other places. There's a whole debate that goes on during this time period that's kind of ugly. Bottom line is, after World War II, immigration from Europe to Palestine becomes kind of this stopgap for the sins of Europe's war, this horrific event that has happened. And so more and more Jews are immigrating to Palestine from Europe. Now, the British have just fought 2 world wars. Technically, they won both of them, but just barely. And in terms of politically, economically, militarily, they're exhausted. Most of the European powers are, to be honest. America is one of the few countries other than Russia that comes out of that war, benefiting in a way. But the British are an exhausted empire, and they're starting to pull back from all of their different obligations around the world, we'll call them. This is one of them they start to pull back from. Part of the reason, there's a lot of reasons that go on here, but as this immigration is taking place after World War II, and more immigrants are coming into the situation, the British didn't really want that immigration. They were having a hard time keeping a lid on the violence between the Palestinians and the Jewish immigrants that were there as it was. And you can look at letters between President Truman, our president at the time, and Prime Minister Attlee of Britain, and you look at these back and forth letters, and Attlee keeps telling Truman, look, we're barely holding on to things. We don't need more people here right now. Truman said, look, if you want us to help you after the war, these folks need a place to go, you will accept them. And he pressures him, and it works. But it works so effectively that the Brits finally get to a point where they say, we can't do this anymore. And they turn control of this region over to a new organization at the time called the United Nations. United Nations take over. The United Nations send in experts to study the situation, figure out what are we going to do. These two groups keep fighting. There's land here. How do we figure out a way to solve this problem? And somebody comes up with the idea, well, we'll divide it. And this is the 1947 partition plan, it's called. You divide the land up. You give some to the Jewish immigrants. You give some to the Palestinians. Problem solved. Everybody's got their own land. Nobody needs to fight anymore. Great. Here's the way the plan worked. And there were different plans, but anyway, this is the one that finally went through. You had a population at the time of about 680,000 Jewish immigrants at the time. You had about 1.3 million Palestinians in population at the time. They did a study, talked to people, looked at where people were at, divided the territory up, and they gave 55% of the land to the Jewish immigrants, and they gave 45% of the land to the Palestinian population. These are rough numbers.
Why is that larger group gets less?
That's a good question. How do you suppose this was accepted? I mean, you guys know nothing about it, but what would you guess the views would be in the Jewish community?
They thought they should have gotten more.
There were some that thought they should have gotten more, but just in general, knowing human nature, what would you say in that situation?
Money.
Cool. Take it and run, right? What would you say if you were Palestinian? Yeah, you'd be a little upset. I haven't even brought in the numbers that look at how much by land deed, legal land deed ownership the Palestinians and the Jewish population owned. At this point in time, there's debatable numbers, but most of the numbers are over 90% of the land was owned by Palestinians legally by land deed at the time. So when they looked at this, to them, it looked like a huge land grab, and it looked like the end of their society. The Jewish immigrants debated about this. Some wanted more, some had different views on it, but the ones that were in leadership at the time basically said, cool, we'll take the deal. Palestinians really didn't even show up to this particular meeting because they felt it was wrong, so they decided to boycott it. By the way, if you ever get a chance in human history to have a crucial meeting about how much land you're going to get, don't boycott it if you're ticked, because you lose. That's what happened here. They boycotted the meeting, and things start to spin, and essentially this Jewish population right here declares themselves a state. This is going to be the birth of the state of Israel. From here on out, when I talk about these people, I will call them Israelis, not Jewish immigrants, because they will be members of the state of Israel. The state of Israel is declared in 1948.